In October 1927, in a hotel in Brussels, some of the greatest physicists in the world gathered beneath heavy chandeliers for the Fifth Solvay Conference. The room was crowded with names that would define modern science. Yet again and again, attention drifted toward one man. Albert Einstein, already a legend, had come with a quiet but persistent unease. Around him, a new vision of nature was taking shape, one built from probabilities, uncertainties, and strange rules that seemed to grow less intuitive the more successful they became. Imagine the atmosphere for a moment. Pages of equations, cigarette smoke, low voices in several languages, and behind it all, a feeling that reality itself was being renegotiated. By then, Einstein had already changed physics more than once. He had helped reveal that light could behave in quantum-like ways, had transformed ideas of space and time, and had shown gravity not as a force in the old sense, but as the geometry of the universe itself. Few people were better placed to understand how radical the new quantum theory really was. And yet that was precisely the problem. He could see its power, but he could also feel what it asked physicists to surrender. The world described by the new theory seemed fragmented, elusive, and unfinished. Einstein wanted something deeper, something beneath the probabilities, a hidden order that would restore unity to nature. So while much of 20th century physics moved toward the quantum world, Einstein turned more and more toward a different dream. He began searching for a single framework that could bring the forces of nature together. A grand field theory that would reveal the universe as one coherent whole. It was not an absurd hope. In the early decades of modern physics, it could even seem like the most beautiful next step. But beauty in science has a dangerous power. Sometimes it leads toward truth. Sometimes it keeps a brilliant mind walking further into a landscape that will never open. This is the story of that long pursuit. It is the story of a scientist who was not simply left behind, but who refused, for deep philosophical reasons, to accept the terms on which the future was arriving. Why did Einstein spend so many years chasing a vision that never became the foundation he hoped for? And what does it mean when one of the greatest minds in history cannot let go of a beautiful idea? In October of 1927, as evening settled over Brussels and the light outside the windows began to thin, a room full of physicists gathered beneath chandeliers in the Hotel Metropole for the Fifth Solvay Conference. The air would have carried that familiar mixture of polished wood, paper, tobacco, wool coats drying from the damp, and the low murmur of several languages crossing one another in quick, careful currents. On the tables were notebooks, fountain pens, handwritten formulas, pages folded and reopened. Nothing in the room looked supernatural, and yet almost everyone there understood that they were standing at a strange threshold. The ordinary furniture of the world, light, matter, motion, cause and effect, had begun to behave in ways that no older picture of nature could comfortably contain. If you imagine yourself there for a moment, not as a spectator to a famous moment in science, but as someone quietly listening from the edge of the room, what you would feel first is not triumph. It is unease. Reality is being described in a new language, and even the people inventing that language are not entirely sure what kind of world it is revealing. Again and again, attention drifts toward one figure. Albert Einstein is already the most famous scientist alive, the face most people now associate with genius itself. Yet his presence in that room is not simply ceremonial, and it is not passive. He is not there to bless the new physics from a distance. He is there because something in it troubles him at a very deep level. Around him sit younger men whose work is beginning to remake the foundations of the subject. Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, Max Born, Paul Dirac, Niels Bohr. They are building a theory that works with extraordinary power. It predicts, calculates, and explains with a precision that older approaches could not reach. But the more clearly the new quantum mechanics succeeds, the stranger its meaning seems to become. It does not offer a calm, continuous picture of nature unfolding beneath the surface. It offers jumps, probabilities, abstract states, and a growing sense that the world at its smallest scales may not possess the kind of definite order that physicists had long assumed. Einstein listens, questions, thinks, and resists in a room crowded with brilliance. He is still the most luminous mind present, yet he is also the one least willing to surrender to the direction in which brilliance is moving. That is the paradox at the heart of this story. And like most true paradoxes, it becomes more mysterious the closer you look at it. Einstein was not a defender of some tired old orthodoxy. He had not spent his life protecting the certainties of 19th century science. Quite the opposite. He had shattered them. He had helped break apart the comfortable world that so many others were still learning to leave behind. To later generations, this can seem almost impossible to hold in the mind at once. The same man who became a symbol of revolution in science would eventually become the most famous critic of its newest revolution. The same intellect that taught the modern world to distrust naive intuitions about time, space, motion, and light would grow increasingly dissatisfied with the theory that seemed to complete the overthrow of common sense. It is tempting to tell that story too quickly, as though genius simply hardened into stubbornness, as though one generation gave way to the next and could not bear being surpassed. But that version is too easy, and worse than that, it is not very interesting. The deeper story is quieter and more unsettling. Einstein did not fail to understand what was happening. He understood it so well that he could feel, with unusual sharpness, exactly what was being asked of physics, and exactly what he thought physics should never give up. By the time the Solvay delegates gathered in Brussels, the public image of Einstein had already drifted far away from the inner reality of his work. Since 1919, when observations during a solar eclipse were announced as confirming one of the striking predictions of general relativity, Einstein had become something close to a global phenomenon. Newspapers turned him into an emblem, a human shorthand for the new age. His face, his hair, his violin, his accented speech, his refusal to dress with much ceremony, all of it fed the growing legend. To the wider world, he was the sage who had bent the universe itself, the magician of curved space, the thinker who proved that nature was subtler than anyone had guessed. But celebrity has a way of flattening the mind it celebrates. It turns a difficult person into an image. Behind the public fascination was a man still deeply engaged in technical work, still arguing in letters, still worrying over equations, still dissatisfied. Einstein did not live inside the myth that had formed around him. He lived inside problems. And by the mid-1920s, one problem in particular had begun to separate him from the mood of the field that had once seemed almost made for him. The irony becomes even sharper when we remember just how much Einstein himself had done to open the door through which quantum physics entered. In 1905, the year often called his Annus Mirabilis, he did not merely write on special relativity, he also proposed that light, long understood as a wave, could in certain circumstances behave as though it came in discrete packets of energy. That idea, which he used to explain the photoelectric effect, was not a minor side note. It was one of the founding moves of quantum theory. In that same astonishing year, he helped give statistical reality to atoms through his work on Brownian motion, showing that matter itself need not be treated as a smooth continuum, but could be approached through hidden, restless granularity. His mind seemed drawn again and again toward places where classical pictures dissolved. He was not clinging to an older universe. He was among the people who had first shown how incomplete the older universe was. And the pattern continued. Einstein's work did not stop being relevant to the quantum world after 1905. Over the following years, he made major contributions to the quantum theory of radiation, including the idea of stimulated emission, which would much later underlie the laser. In the 1920s, after receiving a paper from the Indian physicist Satyendra Nath Bose, he recognized its importance at once, translated it into German, and extended the reasoning to material particles, helping to create what is now called Bose-Einstein statistics. Even here, at the edge of a new microscopic world, Einstein was not absent, not confused, not excluded. He could see that something powerful was emerging. He had helped build part of it with his own hands. That matters because it strips away the easiest explanation for his later resistance. He was not objecting because the theory was too modern for him. He had been modern before many of its champions. He was objecting because he believed that the new theory, however successful, was pointing physics toward a picture of reality that was in some essential sense incomplete. To understand the force of that discomfort, it helps to linger for a moment in the scientific atmosphere from which quantum mechanics arose. By the early 20th century, classical physics had become both magnificent and strained. It had explained planetary motion, electromagnetism, heat, waves, and the motions of bodies with extraordinary success. Maxwell had unified electricity and magnetism into a single theoretical framework of breathtaking elegance. Mechanics and field theory together seemed to promise that nature might be described as an orderly whole. Yet cracks had appeared. Blackbody radiation refused to fit older expectations. Atomic spectra displayed sharp regularities that classical models could not explain. The stability of atoms themselves became a puzzle. If electrons were really little charged bodies orbiting a nucleus in the classical way, they should radiate energy and collapse inward. Matter should not hold together as it plainly did. One by one, certain corners of the universe began to behave like messages from a reality deeper and less intuitive than the old frameworks allowed. In those years, many physicists learned to live with provisional compromise. Niels Bohr's model of the atom, introduced in 1913, worked by combining classical images with quantum restrictions that no one could yet fully justify. Electrons could occupy certain allowed states and not others. They could jump discontinuously. Between energy levels, it was an astonishingly fruitful model, and at the same time an unsettling one. It carried the marks of a theory in transition, a structure that could calculate more than it could explain. For a while, this half-lit territory remained tolerable because results kept coming. Spectra were accounted for. Patterns emerged. But the old continuity of motion, the old confidence that one could picture physical processes unfolding through space and time, was becoming harder to preserve. Physics was not simply adding new facts. It was beginning to lose its previous language for what facts were. Then, in the middle of the 1920s, the pace quickened. Heisenberg developed matrix mechanics. Schrödinger formulated wave mechanics. Born proposed a probabilistic interpretation of the wave function. Dirac brought a new level of formal power and abstraction. Within a remarkably short time, quantum mechanics transformed from a patchwork of rules into a precise, formidable framework. It worked. That simple fact cannot be overstated. It worked in ways that were dazzling to those who had struggled through the awkward years of the old quantum theory. It organized bewildering phenomena. It generated predictions. It gave the microscopic world a mathematics that no one could now ignore. To many younger physicists, the sensation was almost liberating. At last, there was a usable theory. At last, the strange behavior of atoms could be handled without pretending that classical intuition still ruled beneath the surface. Einstein admired the achievement. He was not blind to it, and he did not deny its force. But somewhere beneath the admiration was a growing sense of loss. Quantum mechanics did not simply demand new equations. It seemed to ask physicists to abandon the hope that a theory should tell a fully coherent story about what the world is doing when no one is looking. It allowed, and in some interpretations seemed to require, a distinction between what can be said about a system and what the system is independently of measurement. It turned the act of observation into something far more central than Einstein was prepared to accept. The theory appeared to succeed by loosening the bond between mathematics and a clear underlying picture of reality. For many, that was a price worth paying. For Einstein, it felt like a sign that the theory had reached extraordinary effectiveness without yet reaching final truth. That is why the scene in Brussels matters so much. The famous exchanges there between Einstein and Bohr have often been remembered as a contest of intellect, and they certainly were that. But they were also a contest between two temperaments of science. Einstein would propose thought experiments meant to expose weakness, incompleteness, or contradiction in the new framework. Bohr would respond, often with extraordinary speed and conceptual flexibility, showing how quantum reasoning could survive the challenge. To later readers, these episodes can look almost theatrical, a duel of genius against genius. In reality, they were stranger than that. No one in the room doubted quantum mechanics was powerful. The question was what sort of power it possessed. Was it the power of a final theory, or the power of a brilliant instrument that worked before its foundations were truly understood? Einstein could not let that question rest. He returned to it again and again, not because he enjoyed being contrary, but because he felt that something immense was at stake. If physics accepted probability, complementarity, and the limits of classical description as ultimate, then one of the oldest hopes of science, that the world is intelligible through a deeper and more unified order, might be slipping out of reach. There is something almost lonely in that position, though at this stage the loneliness is still hidden inside prestige. Einstein in 1927 is only in his late 40s. He is not yet the white-haired patriarch of popular memory. Not yet. The elderly figure at Princeton, turning over papers in solitude. He is still vigorous, playful, sharply engaged, fully capable of leading the room into difficult terrain. And yet you can feel, even here, the first outline of a separation. The field is moving one way. Einstein, without ceasing to be Einstein, is beginning to lean another. This is what makes the story so absorbing. If he had simply grown slow, or narrow, or incapable of following the mathematics, the whole thing would be less haunting. But his divergence arises from strengths that once made him indispensable. He trusted coherence. He trusted that beneath the surface variety of phenomena, there should be some lawful unity. He trusted that a physical theory ought to describe the world itself, not merely the probabilities of our encounters with it. The very instincts that had once made him revolutionary were now leading him into conflict with the revolution that followed. And behind those instincts was a memory of victory that mattered more than most people notice. Einstein had seen what it meant for scattered problems to fall into a new order. Special relativity had shown that space and time, once treated separately, belonged to a deeper structure. General relativity had gone further, revealing gravity not as a mysterious force acting across emptiness, but as the curvature of space-time itself. These were not small corrections. They were acts of profound conceptual simplification, the kind that make the universe appear at once stranger and more harmonious. When a mind has seen nature yield in that way, it is hard to believe that the deeper truth of the world will finally rest in fragments, statistical rules, and renunciations of visualizable order. Einstein's dissatisfaction with quantum mechanics was therefore not just a scientific disagreement. It was the continuation of a habit of mind, perhaps even of hope. He had spent years discovering that reality was subtler than appearance and more unified than convention assumed. Why should that pattern suddenly end at the atomic scale? Why should the final lesson of physics be that the universe becomes less intelligible the deeper we look? So the central mystery of this documentary is not merely why Einstein criticized quantum mechanics. It is why one of the most penetrating intelligences in history, a man who had repeatedly sensed hidden order where others saw chaos, found himself increasingly unable to accept the most successful theory of his age. What did he think it was missing? What kind of world was he still searching for? And how did the greatest scientific celebrity on Earth become, in one crucial respect, a dissenter from the future that bore his fingerprints? These questions do not open out from ignorance. They open out from a very particular kind of understanding. The understanding of someone who sees not only what a theory can do, but what it asks us to believe. As the 1920s wore on, Einstein did not simply remain unconvinced by quantum mechanics. He began to look more steadily toward another horizon, one that promised not just local fixes or interpretive patches, but a deeper architecture beneath the visible pieces of modern physics. If quantum theory seemed too fragmented, perhaps the real task was not to accept fragmentation more gracefully. Perhaps it was to search for a more comprehensive order in which gravity, electromagnetism, matter, and motion might all be expressions of a single underlying structure. The road that opened before him would be long, elegant, isolating, and ultimately unsuccessful. But to see why he stepped onto it at all, we have to leave this room in Brussels, with its brilliant arguments and growing divisions, and go back to an earlier moment in the history of physics, when the dream of unity did not yet look like refusal, it looked like destiny. To see why that road seemed so compelling, you have to leave Brussels behind and travel back into an earlier mood of physics, into a time when the universe still appeared willing to yield its complexity in great, elegant compressions, long before Einstein's later years at Princeton, long before unified field theory acquired the aura of a beautiful obsession. There was a genuine and growing confidence among many physicists that nature might be far more coherent than its surfaces suggested. The clues were already there. Different phenomena that had once seemed unrelated had begun, one by one, to reveal hidden kinships. Forces that looked separate were discovered to be aspects of a deeper pattern. Familiar distinctions started to soften, and for a certain kind of mind, especially a mind like Einstein's, this did not feel like a temporary convenience. It felt like a glimpse of the true shape of reality. The 19th century had ended with one of the most intoxicating achievements in the history of science. Electricity and magnetism, once studied as different domains with their own strange behaviors, had been drawn together into a single theoretical structure by James Clerk Maxwell. That union did more than solve technical puzzles. It changed the emotional texture of physics. Separate effects could turn out to be one thing seen from different angles. Invisible processes could be rendered intelligible through mathematics. Light itself, once treated almost as a separate wonder, emerged as an electromagnetic wave. There is something quietly transformative in that kind of success. Once you have watched nature allow such a synthesis, it becomes hard not to hope for more. The appetite for unity grows with each victory. For many physicists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fields became the language in which this hope could be most naturally expressed. A field was not a little object moving from place to place like a bead on a wire. It was an arrangement of influence extending through space, a structured condition of the world itself. By thinking in terms of fields, one could begin to picture reality less as a collection of separate particles occasionally colliding, and more as a continuous fabric with local variations, tensions, and curvatures, matter, force, radiation, perhaps even motion itself, might someday be understood within one shared framework. The older mechanical pictures had not disappeared, but field thinking carried a distinctive promise. It suggested that the universe might not be assembled from disconnected pieces at all. It might be one continuous order, wearing many different appearances. Einstein was unusually prepared to respond to that promise, even before general relativity. His scientific instincts ran toward hidden coherence, special relativity, published in 1905, had already taken concepts that were treated as separate and revealed them to be deeply intertwined. Space and time could no longer be understood as independent backdrops. Measurements of length and duration were bound to motion, perspective, and the invariant speed of light. It was a theory that removed certain comforting intuitions while replacing them with a sharper and more unified order. That pattern would become one of the defining habits of Einstein's mind. He was willing to let go of familiar appearances, but only when doing so led to a more powerful and internally harmonious picture of nature. He was not drawn to strangeness for its own sake. He was drawn to deeper simplicity. That instinct reached its grandest expression in general relativity. When the theory was completed in 1915, gravity ceased to be, in the old Newtonian sense, a force mysteriously reaching across empty space. Instead, mass and energy shaped spacetime itself, and bodies moved along the geometry of that curved structure. To say this today is almost to speak a familiar formula, but at the time it was an astonishing act of conceptual reorganization, a phenomenon that had governed falling apples, orbiting planets, and the architecture of the heavens for centuries was absorbed into a new and more comprehensive vision. Gravity was no longer something added to the universe from outside. It became part of the universe's shape. And again, the lesson was irresistible. Nature looked complicated until one found the right conceptual order, and then what seemed separate could turn out to be one. You can see how dangerous that success might become for a mind like Einstein's. Dangerous, not because it was false, but because it confirmed a style of hope. General relativity did not merely solve a problem. It taught by example, that the deepest truths of physics might appear as geometrical unifications, as reorganizations so profound that old distinctions simply dissolved inside them. Once you have seen gravity reimagined in that way, why should electromagnetism not also be folded into a wider structure? Why should matter itself not eventually emerge from the same set of underlying relations? In the years after 1915, the dream of a fully unified description of nature did not feel eccentric. It felt like a continuation of the most successful conceptual movement in modern physics. This helps explain why the early decades of the 20th century were filled with attempts to push unification further. The atmosphere was not one of solitary obsession. It was a genuine frontier. Hermann Bayle, one of the most brilliant mathematicians of the time, proposed in 1918 an ambitious theory that tried to link gravitation and electromagnetism through a generalized geometric framework. The details were difficult and controversial, and Einstein admired parts of the mathematical elegance while objecting to its physical consequences. Yet the very existence of such proposals tells us something important. The dream of unity was not a private fixation belonging to one man. It belonged, at least for a time, to the broader imagination of fundamental physics. It was part of what the field still expected reality might permit. Then came Theodore Kaluza's remarkable suggestion in 1919, later developed further by Oscar Klein. Kaluza proposed that if one extended general relativity into a fifth dimension, the equations naturally produced both gravity and electromagnetism. To modern ears, an extra dimension may sound strange from the outset, but in the context of that period, the idea carried a rare kind of beauty. It hinted that forces which appeared separate in ordinary experience might be the shadow of one higher dimensional order, a hidden structure, imperceptible in direct life, might generate the variety seen below. One can feel why such proposals would have appealed to Einstein even when he did not fully adopt them. They belonged to the same family of thought. They treated nature as something whose apparent multiplicity might emerge from deeper unity. All of this unfolded against a background in which electromagnetism still possessed extraordinary prestige. Maxwell's theory was not merely successful. It had the sheen of inevitability that great theories sometimes acquire after they have remade an entire field. It was mathematically rich, experimentally secure, and conceptually powerful. For a long time, it was natural to wonder whether electromagnetism was not simply one force among others, but part of a deeper key to physical reality itself. If general relativity had transformed gravity into geometry, and if electromagnetism already carried this aura of formal perfection, then bringing the two together could seem like the next majestic step. Such a project did not yet have the feel of defiance. It had the feel of continuation. There was another reason the hope remained alive. Physics in the 1910s and early 1920s did not yet possess the later abundance of fundamental particles and interactions that would complicate the picture so severely. The world of the very small was certainly mysterious, but in some respects it still looked relatively spare. Matter could often be discussed in terms of electrons, nuclei, radiation, and a small set of recurring structures. The strong and weak nuclear forces had not yet been organized into the dominant framework they would later acquire. Quantum field theory had not yet matured into the language that would govern much of 20th century high-energy physics. In that earlier landscape, a program aimed at unifying gravitation and electromagnetism did not appear hopelessly narrow. It could still plausibly present itself as a route toward foundations. That narrower world was also a more visualizable world. Many physicists still hoped that with enough ingenuity, one might derive particles as localized features of continuous fields, or understand matter as an expression of geometry, or reduce apparent discreteness to a deeper continuity. The full rupture between classical intuition and microscopic physics had not yet hardened into consensus. Even those who worked with quantum ideas often did so while feeling that the final conceptual picture remained unfinished. In such a climate, Einstein's preference for continuity, lawful structure, and unified description did not mark him as a relic. It aligned him with a question that was still very much alive. There is a tendency, looking backward, to imagine that the eventual winners in science must always have appeared inevitable to the people living through the transition. But intellectual history almost never feels like that from the inside. The paths that later turn into dead ends often seem, at the time, beautifully illuminated. They attract gifted minds because they arise from real successes, from honest analogies, from methods that have already proven their power. Unified field theory in the 1920s had exactly that quality. It was nourished by the prestige of Maxwell, by the triumph of relativity, by the conceptual fertility of geometry, and by the still open question of how the strange behavior of atoms should ultimately be placed within a deeper picture of nature. Nothing about this made the path foolish. On the contrary, it made the path noble. For Einstein, noble paths mattered. He was not only a solver of equations, he was a thinker with a particular standard for what counted as an acceptable view of reality. He valued theories that did more than predict. He wanted them to reveal structure, to expose necessity, to show why the world had to be this way rather than another. In his best work, he had repeatedly seen formal beauty and physical truth reinforce one another. This did not make him naive. It gave him confidence that the universe was not a patchwork of disconnected rules, but a lawful whole waiting for the right conceptual language. If one remembers that, his turn toward unification begins to look less like stubbornness and more like fidelity to the deepest lessons of his own career. And there was something emotionally persuasive in the very word unity. Science, especially in its most ambitious moments, does not live on data alone. It also lives on images of order that draw people forward before the evidence is complete. The hope that the bewildering variety of nature might arise from one underlying scheme is more than a technical aspiration. It is a form of intellectual peace. It offers the possibility that the world, however strange in detail, is not fundamentally fractured. For a generation that had already watched light, space, time, and gravity undergo profound reinterpretation, that hope did not feel excessive. It felt earned. You might say that by the early 1920s, physics contained two different futures at once. One future moved toward the quantum world, toward indeterminacy, operators, probability amplitudes, and an increasingly abstract mathematics of what could be known and measured. The other still leaned toward a grand synthesis in which geometry, continuity, and field structure would absorb the apparent disorder into a higher coherence. At that stage, neither future had fully closed the other out. They coexisted in tension, like two melodies passing through the same room, before one slowly begins to dominate. Einstein did not yet stand wholly apart from his contemporaries. He stood at the junction where both possibilities remained visible. This is why the phrase, "the wrong idea," needs to be handled with care. In retrospect, unified field theory in Einstein's hands did not lead to the foundation he hoped for, but at the moment he turned toward it more seriously. The idea drew its force from some of the finest achievements in all of physics. It was rooted in genuine victories of thought. It extended patterns that had already worked. It answered to a real philosophical hunger, one shared far beyond Einstein alone. A viewer standing in those years, without knowledge of what later decades would confirm or discard, could have looked at the available roads and found the dream of unity not merely plausible, but perhaps even the most profound route still open. That helps us understand the quiet seduction of the project. It was not only the mathematics, though the mathematics carried immense allure. It was the feeling that one might still bring the world back into a single, intelligible form after the first shocks of modern physics had scattered familiar certainties. Relativity had shown that deeper order could hide beneath common sense. Why should the same not be true of everything else? Why should electricity, gravitation, matter, and motion not belong to one architecture, waiting to be seen from the correct angle? Einstein was not chasing a fantasy invented in isolation. He was following an intuition that had already been rewarded more than once by reality itself. And yet, as the quantum theory hardened into an increasingly powerful framework, the very qualities that made unification so appealing would begin to sharpen a deeper division. The dream of unity was bound up with an idea of what a scientific theory ought to be, how reality ought to present itself to reason, and how much mystery one should tolerate at the foundation of nature. Einstein was moving toward a program. Yes, but beneath the program was an even more consequential commitment. To understand why he could not simply accept the new quantum order and move on, we have to look more closely at what he believed science was for, and what kind of truth he thought a physical theory was meant to deliver. To understand why he could not simply accept the new quantum order and move on, we have to slow down and look beneath the mathematics, beneath the headlines, and even beneath the famous gestures of disagreement that later became part of his legend. Einstein's resistance was never just the irritation of an older scientist losing patience with unfamiliar tools. It grew from a deeper conviction about what science is for, what a theory ought to do, and what sort of world reason should be trying to uncover. He was not defending comfort. He was defending intelligibility. And the more successful quantum mechanics became, the more sharply he felt that it was asking physicists to lower their expectations at the very moment they should have been pressing hardest toward a deeper account of reality. By the 1920s, many physicists were becoming comfortable with a striking new attitude. A theory did not necessarily need to describe what was happening underneath appearances in any classical sense. It only needed to give the right results, to predict what would be observed, to connect calculation with experiment. This was not a trivial shift. It marked a quiet change in the moral atmosphere of physics. Earlier generations had often aimed to picture the world, to say what existed, how it moved, and why it behaved as it did whether or not anyone was watching. The new quantum mechanics, especially in the form increasingly associated with Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, seemed to loosen that ambition. It left many traditional questions standing, but altered their status. Some questions were now treated as misguided, or at least as unanswerable in the old way. Einstein found that deeply unsettling. He did not object because the theory was difficult or abstract. His own work had never been easy, and he had little patience for the idea that difficulty itself could be grounds for complaint. What disturbed him was something more philosophical and more intimate. He believed that physics should describe a world that exists independently of acts of measurement. A moon does not come into being because someone looks at it. A particle should not owe its reality to the particular experimental arrangement used to detect it. Beneath the practical business of calculation, Einstein wanted a theory to tell us what nature is, not merely what we can say about it under specific conditions. This is where the word realism becomes important, though it can sound more technical than it really is. In Einstein's case, realism meant the conviction that the physical world has definite features independent of our observations, concepts, or choices of measurement. That belief may sound almost obvious at first hearing. For most of ordinary life, it is the background assumption of thought itself. The room continues to exist when you leave it. A star does not vanish because no telescope is turned toward it. Einstein's discomfort arose because the emerging interpretations of quantum mechanics seemed to threaten that common sense metaphysical trust, not at the scale of tables and planets, but at the scale where the structure of matter itself had to be understood. If reality, at its foundation, became inseparable from what could be measured about it, then the aim of physics had changed in a way he found both profound and dangerous. The point is easy to flatten into the claim that Einstein simply disliked probability. Yet probability was not foreign to him. He had used statistical methods earlier in his career and understood perfectly well that science often works with distributions, averages, and incomplete information. What he resisted was the stronger suggestion that probability might be fundamental. That chance was not merely a sign of ignorance, but part of the ultimate fabric of nature. He did not want indeterminacy to stand at the bottom of explanation. For Einstein, a theory built on irreducible probabilities felt less like a finished portrait of the world than like a remarkably successful intermediate step. It might organize observations with dazzling power, while still failing to reveal the underlying order from which those observations arose. That distinction between a useful theory and a complete one became central to his objections. Einstein did not spend these years saying quantum mechanics was worthless. On the contrary, he repeatedly acknowledged its impressive success. He could see that it worked. He could see why younger physicists were excited by it. He could see that it captured real features of atomic behavior that older models could not manage. But usefulness and completeness were, for him, different categories. A theory could be empirically brilliant and still leave the world itself insufficiently described. His complaint was not that quantum mechanics gave wrong answers. It was that the answers came from a framework he regarded as partial, provisional, and philosophically unfinished. You can hear this most clearly in his long exchange with Max Born. Their correspondence stretched over many years and became one of the most revealing windows into Einstein's mature outlook. Born, one of the key architects of the probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics, accepted that the new theory required a different attitude toward physical reality. Einstein remained unconvinced in those letters. His unease was often calm, precise, and almost sorrowful rather than theatrical. He did not write like a man shouting at the future. He wrote like someone who admired the brilliance of a new construction while suspecting that its foundation had been laid on sand. Again and again, he returned to the thought that the statistical character of the theory could not be final. There was a related issue that mattered just as much to him, and perhaps even more than later summaries tend to capture. Einstein cared deeply about locality and continuity. He had spent much of his scientific life trusting that physical influences should unfold in a lawful way through space and time, not leap mysteriously across gaps with no underlying mediation. General relativity had intensified that sensibility. It described a world in which geometry, matter, and motion belonged to one continuous structure. Quantum mechanics, especially in its more puzzling features, seemed to pull in the opposite direction. It replaced the smooth development of understandable processes with abstract states, abrupt outcomes, and a strange dependence on how the system was interrogated. For someone committed to lawful continuity, this was more than a technical inconvenience. It felt like a wound in the image of nature. There was also the question of what counted as explanation. Einstein had never been content with formulas alone. He wanted to know why the equations took the form they did, and what sort of reality would make them necessary. In his best work, mathematics was inseparable from physical insight. The formalism mattered, but it mattered because it disclosed order, quantum mechanics. By contrast, increasingly appeared to many practitioners as a formal apparatus whose interpretive meaning could remain elusive without diminishing its predictive success. Forebore. That situation did not represent a defeat. It represented maturity, a recognition that classical concepts could only be applied within limits, and that physics must learn to speak more modestly about what lies beyond measurement. Einstein heard something else in that modesty. He heard resignation. That is why his objections cannot be reduced to temperament. Though temperament certainly played a role, Einstein was patient, intuitive, often playful in conversation. But intellectually, he was also severe. He disliked conceptual vagueness. He distrusted solutions that seemed to save the phenomena while evading the deeper demand for coherence. He could live with difficulty, with abstraction, even with radical revision of inherited concepts, provided the end result offered a stronger grasp of reality. What he could not comfortably accept was a theory that seemed to work by teaching physicists to stop asking certain ontological questions altogether. Once that happened, science risked becoming a disciplined management of appearances, rather than a search for what truly exists beneath them. Part of the tension came from Einstein's own intellectual biography. His most transformative achievements had come from taking apparently separate domains and revealing the deeper structure that unified them. He knew from experience that the world can look confused when the underlying concepts are wrong. He also knew that radically new theories can at first seem to destroy intuitive understanding, only to restore it at a more profound level later on. From his perspective, quantum mechanics might simply be in that incomplete stage. It had the signs of success, certainly, but also the marks of a framework waiting to be absorbed into something more comprehensive. A probabilistic formalism could be a symptom of ignorance, not a final revelation. What others treated as the end point of explanation, Einstein treated as evidence that the real explanatory work remained unfinished. His famous resistance to the idea of a fundamentally random universe should be understood in that wider light. He did not reject disorder because he longed for an emotionally comforting cosmos. He rejected it because he believed nature, at its deepest level, should still be lawful enough to be described through objective structure rather than through the statistical outcomes of observation. He wanted a world in which physical properties belonged to systems before measurement, not only during it. He wanted theory to recover an external reality with definite features, even if those features were hidden from immediate view. Behind all the technical arguments was a very old scientific dream. The dream that reason can reach beyond the surface of events and uncover what must be there, whether or not human beings are present to witness it. This is also why Einstein's position has sometimes been misunderstood as simple conservatism. In one sense, he was conservative, because he wished to preserve a robust conception of objective reality. But in another sense, he was demanding something far more radical than many of his contemporaries. He was asking for a theory deeper than quantum mechanics, not a retreat to classical physics. He did not want to rewind science to a safer century. He wanted to move beyond the existing quantum framework toward a more complete account that would explain why the statistical rules worked at all. To him, the prevailing orthodoxy was what looked timid. It accepted stunning predictive success and then, too quickly in his eyes, declared the search for deeper intelligibility either misguided or unnecessary. For the younger generation, that verdict often seemed liberating. Physics had struggled for decades with the old quantum theory. Improvised models, unstable conceptual pictures, and awkward compromises. Now there was a formalism that gave answers. Why insist on metaphysical clarity that might never come? Why demand a visualizable reality beneath equations that already matched experiment? Einstein understood the appeal of that pragmatism, but he feared the cost. A science satisfied with operational success alone might grow extraordinarily powerful while quietly shrinking its own philosophical ambition. It might become better and better at prediction while surrendering the ancient hope that nature forms a coherent world, independent of the instruments used to probe it. So when Einstein fought over the meaning of quantum mechanics, he was fighting on behalf of a standard. He was trying to defend the idea that explanation should still aim at objective reality, that the world must possess a determinate structure not exhausted by measurement outcomes, and that the apparent incompleteness of a theory should not be concealed by its practical success. This standard had shaped his entire scientific life. It was present in the way he approached relativity, in the way he trusted principles to reveal hidden order, and in the way he judged physical understanding to be something deeper than efficient calculation. Once you see that, his later path begins to feel less like a personal eccentricity and more like the continuation of a philosophical commitment that had already defined him for decades. And yet, commitments of that kind are never tested in solitude. They become sharpest when placed against another powerful mind that sees the same scientific revolution and draws the opposite lesson from it. Einstein's concerns about realism, completeness, and the purpose of theory did not remain private reflections in letters and notebooks. They moved into open confrontation. In conference rooms, in papers, in carefully shaped thought experiments. They collided with Bohr's profoundly different vision of what quantum physics was telling humanity about the limits of description itself. That is where the quiet philosophical tension of these years would harden into one of the most consequential intellectual struggles in modern science. That collision of visions found its clearest form in Einstein's long encounter with Niels Bohr, a confrontation that unfolded across conference halls, private conversations, published papers, and the inner climate of 20th century physics itself. If Einstein represented the demand that theory must still reach toward an objective world beneath appearances, Bohr came to represent a very different discipline of thought, one that asked physicists to accept limits that earlier generations would have treated as intolerable. He did not approach quantum mechanics as an unfinished bridge back to classical reality. He approached it as a hard lesson in humility. Nature, in his view, was not obliged to preserve the older ideals of visualizable mechanism, and science had to learn to speak more carefully about what could and could not be said. Their disagreement is sometimes remembered as a quarrel over a few famous phrases, as though the entire matter could be compressed into a line about God and dice, then placed neatly on a shelf. But when you move closer, the argument becomes slower, stranger, and more revealing. Einstein did not simply object from outside the theory. He entered into its logic with extraordinary seriousness, looking for places where it seemed to contradict itself or fail to provide a complete account of physical reality. Bohr, in turn, did not merely defend the formalism by authority or by habit. He answered Einstein with a rare flexibility of mind, showing again and again that the new quantum framework could survive challenges that at first glance looked devastating. Each man kept pressing toward the foundations, but they were pressing from opposite directions. Einstein wanted a clearer world than the theory seemed to allow. Bohr wanted physicists to recognize that clarity itself had changed meaning. The famous stage for these encounters was the Solvay Conference, especially the meetings of 1927 and 1930, where a remarkable concentration of scientific talent gathered to think through the emerging quantum world. It is difficult to imagine another room in which so much of modern physics sat together in such condensed form. Yet the most enduring memory of those meetings is not a collective conclusion. It is a recurring pattern. Einstein would devise a thought experiment, a carefully imagined setup meant to reveal some inconsistency or incompleteness in the prevailing interpretation of quantum mechanics. Bohr would listen, worry, pace, and eventually produce a response that preserved the framework while often deepening its philosophical strangeness. To outsiders, this may sound almost like a duel of cleverness. Inside the history of ideas, it was far more consequential. These were tests of what kind of reality science was willing to admit. One reason the exchanges became so memorable is that Einstein argued through physical intuition rather than slogans. He wanted to show, with concrete scenarios, that the theory could not be complete if it forced physicists to abandon certain conditions of intelligibility. In 1927, for example, he explored ways of challenging the uncertainty relations that had been formulated by Heisenberg. Could one not? By setting up a slit or diaphragm in a sufficiently delicate way, determine more about a particle's position and momentum than the new theory seemed to allow? Could one not outwit the logic of uncertainty by attending carefully to the measurement apparatus itself? These were not casual objections. They were precise attempts to locate the point at which quantum mechanics ceased to describe a physically coherent situation. Bohr's replies were equally precise, though they moved in a different spirit. He insisted that the measuring arrangement could not be treated as a neutral window through which nature is passively observed. The arrangement was part of what defined the experimental situation itself. Different setups made different aspects of the system accessible, and no single classical picture could capture all of them at once. This was the heart of his idea of complementarity. A phenomenon could require mutually exclusive descriptions, each valid within its own context, without yielding a single unified image underneath. Position and momentum, wave and particle, continuity and discreteness. These were no longer properties that could be assembled into one seamless representation in the old manner. The attempt to force such a synthesis, Bohr believed, was itself a residue of classical thinking. For Einstein, that answer did not settle the matter. It only exposed the depth of the divide. Complementarity may have organized the interpretive landscape, but it did so by asking physicists to live with a world that could not be fully pictured as objectively structured in one determinate way. In Bohr's hands, the theory became consistent by narrowing the conditions under which consistency had to be demanded. One could speak rigorously, but only by accepting that the meaning of what was said depended essentially on the total experimental arrangement. Einstein heard a retreat in that move. Bohr heard maturity. Their disagreement was therefore not simply about results. It was about what kind of intellectual honesty the new science required. The exchange became even more vivid in 1930 with Einstein's challenge involving a box filled with radiation, an ingenious thought experiment aimed at putting the uncertainty relation for energy and time under pressure. Imagine a box containing light, equipped with a shutter that can be opened for a very brief interval so that a single quantum of radiation escapes. If the box is weighed before and after, Einstein argued, then one might determine the energy of the emitted quantum with arbitrary precision, while the brief timing of the shutter would fix the moment of its escape. In spirit, it was the same form of attack he favored at Solvay. Take the abstract claims of quantum theory and force them into contact with a concrete physical procedure. If the procedure seems intelligible and the theory forbids it, perhaps the theory has overstated its case. Bohr was reportedly shaken by this challenge at first, which itself tells us something important. These were not empty exercises. Einstein's thought experiments had enough force to worry the finest defenders of the new physics. Yet Bohr eventually found a reply, and his reply was deeply characteristic. He argued that once the box is weighed in a gravitational field, the reasoning must include general relativity. The weighing process introduces uncertainties in position that affect the rate of the clock used to time the opening of the shutter. The very act of bringing the box into a measurable relation with the Earth's gravitational field restores the uncertainty that Einstein hoped to escape. There is a beautiful irony here. Bohr used Einstein's own general theory of relativity as part of the defense of quantum mechanics against Einstein's attack. It was a moment in which one revolution came to the rescue of another. Yet even that elegance did not produce peace. Einstein could admire the ingenuity of Bohr's reply without feeling persuaded at the deepest level. One objection after another was answered, but the pattern of the debate itself kept reinforcing his unease. Quantum mechanics survived because it was extraordinarily adaptable, because each challenge could be met by refining the conditions under which experimental statements made sense. But for Einstein, survival under pressure was not the same as explanatory completion. He was not asking whether the theory could be kept intact. He was asking whether the world described by the theory was one a physicist ought finally to accept as fundamental. The more Bohr insisted that physics must give up the demand for a picture of reality independent of measurement, the more Einstein felt confirmed in his suspicion that something essential was being surrendered. There was also a difference in temperament that no formal argument could erase. Bohr was willing to accept obscurity as part of wisdom. He thought the quantum world had taught science that the conditions of observation were woven into the form of knowledge itself. Clear description remained possible, but only within carefully stated experimental contexts. Einstein found that manner of resolution almost unbearable. His mind moved toward principles, toward structural necessity, toward a reality that did not depend for its basic character on the way human beings chose to question it. Where Bohr saw a new grammar of physical description, Einstein saw a sign that the present theory had not yet reached the real grammar of nature. All of this helps explain why the debates never ended in a simple victory. Bohr did not refute Einstein in the sense of making his philosophical concerns disappear. Einstein did not overthrow quantum mechanics in the sense of exposing a technical contradiction that forced the theory's collapse. The confrontation remained unsettled because the two men were measuring success by different standards. Bohr believed the theory had already taught physicists how to think properly about microscopic phenomena. Einstein believed the theory had not yet earned the right to close the search for a deeper account. In that sense, each understood something the other could not fully grant. Bohr grasped the operational power and conceptual discipline of the new framework. Einstein grasped the cost at which that discipline was being purchased. The argument reached one of its most enduring forms in 1935, with the paper Einstein wrote with Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, now known simply as the EPR paper. By then, the public drama of the Solvay meetings had passed, but the deeper issue had not receded. EPR asked whether the quantum mechanical description of physical reality could be considered complete. The paper did not deny that the theory worked. Instead, it tried to show, through a carefully constructed scenario involving two systems that interact and then separate, that quantum mechanics allows one to predict with certainty the value of one quantity or another for a distant system without directly disturbing it. If such predictions are possible, the authors argued, then those quantities correspond to elements of physical reality that the theory itself does not simultaneously represent. In that case, something is missing. This argument carried Einstein's realism into a sharper and more difficult terrain. What bothered him here was not merely uncertainty in measurement. It was the suggestion that the properties of one system could not be assigned definite reality independently of how another distant system was measured. He found that intolerable. A physical world worthy of the name should not depend, in its most basic structure, on choices made elsewhere in a way that seemed to bypass ordinary locality. The EPR paper tried to force the issue calmly and rigorously. Either the quantum description is incomplete, or the world allows a kind of connection that strains the classical idea of separable reality. Einstein preferred incompleteness. He was willing to say that the theory must be missing hidden elements rather than accept that the fabric of the world itself had become so elusive. Bohr's reply to EPR was famously dense, and generations of readers have found it difficult. But the spirit of his response remained consistent with everything he had argued before. He denied that the EPR criteria for physical reality could be applied in the straightforward way Einstein wanted. The conditions under which a prediction is made, Bohr insisted, are inseparable from the total experimental context. Even when no mechanical disturbance in the classical sense occurs, the meaning of physical quantities cannot be detached from the arrangement through which those quantities become definable. To Einstein, that seemed like evasion wrapped in sophistication. To Bohr, it was simply fidelity to what the quantum formalism had already taught. The gulf between them had become almost complete. The remarkable thing is that both men were, in different ways, speaking for possibilities that history would not settle immediately. In the decades that followed, quantum mechanics continued to triumph in practice, and the broader community increasingly treated Einstein's objections as the dignified but outdated resistance of a great man unable to follow the future. There is some truth in that impression, but it is not the whole truth. Einstein's questions about completeness, locality, and the meaning of physical description would not vanish. They would continue to echo through later developments in the philosophy and foundations of physics, long after the cultural momentum of the discipline had turned away from him, even where he did not win. He exposed nerves that remained sensitive. Still, within the immediate historical frame of the 1930s, the direction of travel was becoming harder to mistake. Bohr's manner of thinking increasingly shaped the educated attitude of the field. Younger physicists learned to work fluently within the quantum framework, often with little patience for Einstein's demand that a deeper, more classical form of intelligibility be restored. A subtle shift had occurred. His objections no longer appeared to many as a call toward the next theory. They looked like an inability to accept the philosophical consequences of the current one. The debates with Bohr, therefore, did more than clarify disagreement. They also marked the point at which Einstein's intellectual isolation began to acquire a recognizable outline. And yet, for Einstein himself, the failure to persuade Bohr and the wider community did not bring closure. If anything, it sharpened the direction of his later work. If quantum mechanics could not provide the kind of reality he thought physics required, then the task was not to keep arguing forever at the level of interpretation alone. The task was to search for a deeper framework, one in which the fragmented appearance of the quantum world would emerge from a more unified and objective order. The debates had shown him, with painful clarity, that he and Bohr were no longer traveling toward the same destination. From here on, Einstein's dissatisfaction would turn more and more into a solitary labor of construction, the long attempt to build a theory that could recover the world. He believed reason still had the right to seek. From that point on, the disagreement with quantum mechanics no longer lived only in conference rooms or in the sharp architecture of thought experiments. It began to harden into a direction of work, then into a habit of work, and finally into something closer to a life pattern. Einstein did not decide, in one dramatic instant, to abandon the main current of physics and disappear into a private maze. The transition was slower than that, and more human. He kept engaging with the problems of the age, kept corresponding, kept reading, kept thinking about the foundations of quantum theory. But more and more, his real energy flowed elsewhere. If the existing framework could not deliver the kind of reality he believed science required, then the answer had to lie in construction. Somewhere behind the fragmentary appearance of the world, there had to be a deeper field structure waiting to be found. That hope gave shape to the years that followed. It is important to see what kind of work this was, because later memory can make it look static, as though Einstein simply chose one incorrect idea and repeated it with increasing stubbornness. The record shows something much more restless. He did not spend decades defending a single frozen theory. He tried route after route, shifting mathematical language, altering assumptions, pursuing new formal possibilities, abandoning them, then returning from a different angle. What remained constant was the aspiration. The form kept changing. Unified field theory was not one theory in the simple sense. It was a succession of attempts to discover a theory capable of doing what he wanted nature to do. By the 1920s, Einstein was already searching for a framework in which gravitation and electromagnetism might arise together from a more general geometry. General relativity had made geometry feel like a natural language for deep law, and it was tempting to believe that with a sufficiently rich mathematical structure, the remaining forces of nature could be drawn into the same order. The ambition was not merely to place different equations side by side. Einstein wanted a single set of field equations from which the physical world, or at least its most fundamental architecture, would emerge. Matter, motion, and interaction should no longer appear as separate ingredients stitched together by hand. They should arise from the field itself. That vision shaped his fascination with affine theories, in which the geometry of space-time was treated in a more general way than in ordinary relativity. In these approaches, the mathematical objects used to describe how vectors change from point to point became central, sometimes more central than the metric itself. To a non-specialist, this may sound remote, but the underlying impulse was clear enough. Einstein was looking for a structure broad enough to absorb more of physics into pure geometry. If general relativity had shown that gravity could be read as the curvature of space-time, perhaps electromagnetism, and perhaps even the properties of particles could also be read as manifestations of a deeper geometrical organization. For a while, such avenues seemed promising. They had the right fragrance of necessity. They extended the logic of Einstein's earlier triumphs. They also carried an aesthetic appeal that mattered more than scientific culture sometimes likes to admit. Beautiful mathematical structures do not prove themselves by being beautiful, but they exert real force over the imagination. They suggest hidden order. They create the sensation that a difficult problem is beginning to admit its proper language. Einstein was especially vulnerable to that sensation, not because he was careless, but because some of the greatest successes of his life had involved exactly that experience. The feeling that formal simplicity and physical truth were converging. It is easy, from the outside, to mock beauty when it misleads. It is harder and more honest to remember how often beauty had already guided him well. Then, as often happened in these years, difficulties began to appear. A formulation that looked elegant at first might fail to recover known physics in the right way. A hoped-for relation between equations and observable phenomena would remain vague. Degrees of freedom would proliferate without clear interpretation. A theory might unify symbols on paper while leaving the actual status of matter obscure. Einstein was never careless about such problems. On the contrary, one reason the story is so poignant is that he often identified the defects himself. The notebooks and drafts from these years do not show blind repetition. They show a mind repeatedly narrowing in on a possibility, testing it hard, then discovering that the structure would not hold the weight he had placed upon it. This rhythm becomes especially visible in the late 1920s, when Einstein turned to what came to be known as distant parallelism, or teleparallelism. Here again, the basic hope was not arbitrary. General relativity had used curvature to describe gravitation. But perhaps curvature was not the only geometrical resource available. Perhaps one could build a richer framework in which the relation between directions at distant points carried the key to unification. In a teleparallel geometry, one works with a field of local reference frames, and the mathematical description allows vectors at different points to be compared in a new way. Einstein hoped this might provide the structure from which both gravitation and electromagnetism could emerge. For a time, the idea seemed exciting enough that he announced it publicly with considerable confidence. In 1929, newspapers reported that Einstein had discovered a new unified field theory. The public, already trained to treat his work as a succession of world-changing revelations, responded with fascination. The image is almost cinematic. The most famous scientist on Earth, now older, still pursuing the final key to the universe, still apparently on the brink of another great synthesis. Yet inside the technical literature, things were far less secure. The framework was difficult, its physical interpretation uncertain, and the relation between its formal richness and empirical reality remained unsettled. Einstein kept working, publishing, revising, and probing, but the sense of arrival did not last. This is one of the most revealing patterns of his later life. Again and again, there is a brief season in which a particular route appears, illuminated. A new mathematical formulation seems to bring coherence to the search. The language feels flexible enough, powerful enough, perhaps even inevitable enough to sustain hope. Einstein leans into it, studies its consequences, tests whether particles can be derived, whether motion can emerge from the field equations, whether electromagnetism genuinely appears as more than analogy. Then the structure resists. Internal difficulties multiply. The hoped-for clarity of physical meaning dissolves. A theory that promised to gather the world into one form becomes another incomplete scaffold. He did not face these questions alone, even if later legend sometimes portrays him as an isolated sage at a blackboard. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, he worked with and corresponded with a number of mathematicians and physicists, including Walter Mayer, Cornelius Langsos, Jakob Grommer, and others. These collaborations matter because they reveal the search as a living research program rather than a solitary act of aging defiance. Mayer in particular became an important collaborator in the early 1930s, and together they explored several increasingly abstract formulations of unified field theory. Their work could be technically formidable, often remote from the empirical style that was becoming more dominant elsewhere in physics. But it was not casual speculation. It was disciplined, difficult, and serious. There is also something psychologically important in collaboration at this stage. Working with others can stabilize belief in a program even when the broader field is drifting away from it. Shared effort creates momentum. A difficult theory can continue to feel alive because each new calculation opens another possibility. Each partial result hints that the real insight may lie one step further on. Einstein's notebooks from these years, along with letters and drafts, suggest not someone repeating an exhausted doctrine, but someone continually re-entering the problem. A flaw in one approach did not invalidate the aspiration itself. It only meant the correct structure had not yet been found. That cycle of hope and revision is one of the central experiences of scientific work. Though in Einstein's case, it became unusually prolonged and unusually exposed to posterity. In most careers, failed approaches disappear quietly into unpublished pages. Forgotten seminars, abandoned calculations. With Einstein, almost every stage of the search has attracted scrutiny because his name altered the historical scale of failure. When a less famous physicist spends years exploring an unsuccessful line, the work may simply fade into the background of the discipline. When Einstein does it, the effort becomes part of the mythology of genius itself. Yet the basic texture is familiar to science at its most human. You think a structure is beginning to close. You discover an obstruction. You reformulate the problem. You keep going. He also had a particular reason for persistence. The Unified Field Project was never only about elegance. Einstein hoped, increasingly, that a satisfactory field theory might also explain the existence and motion of particles without introducing them as primitive entities. This aspiration had deep roots. If matter could be understood as a manifestation of the field, then the split between continuous structure and localized objects might disappear. The world would no longer be composed of fields plus particles as separate kinds of things. It would become one order all the way down. Particles might appear as concentrated regions, singularities, or special solutions of the field equations rather than as external additions. That hope carried enormous conceptual weight for him. It promised not just unification of forces, but unification of ontology here too. However, the work ran into recurring trouble. Singularities were difficult to handle. Stable particle-like solutions proved elusive. The mathematical frameworks often generated more structure than physical interpretation. Einstein kept searching for ways to derive motion from the field itself. Since a truly unified theory should not need separate postulates for how matter moves through a background, it does not belong to. This was one of the great lingering ambitions of the late program. The field equations should do everything. They should generate the geometry, account for interaction, and perhaps even explain the existence of the entities we observe. The ideal remained extraordinarily demanding, and the longer it remained unmet, the more it drew him back into further reformulations. By the mid-1930s, after emigration to the United States and the beginning of his years in Princeton, the search had settled into a more enduring rhythm. Einstein was now one of the most recognizable figures in the world, but daily life at the Institute for Advanced Study often returned him to the same interior landscape. Papers spread out, calculations in progress, letters exchanged, old approaches reconsidered, new mathematical possibilities tested. The public saw the icon. The archive reveals the worker. There is a quiet melancholy in that contrast. Fame suggested completion. The actual life was full of incompletion. The grand old revolutionary of modern physics was spending his later years inside a problem that never stopped opening into further technical difficulty. Still, it would be wrong to imagine these decades as a simple decline into repetition. Einstein remained capable of shifting direction when a line of thought no longer persuaded him. He moved through different mathematical strategies, reconsidered earlier assumptions, and at times set aside a program that had absorbed him for years. Teleparallelism eventually lost its hold. Other generalized field approaches took its place. None of them delivered the decisive breakthrough, yet each seemed, for a while, to preserve the chance that the right structure was still nearby. This is how a scientific pursuit becomes a fate, not because one is too rigid to change, but because one is able to change endlessly without ever surrendering the central hope. There is something almost novelistic in the persistence of that pattern. A lesser mind might have tired of it, or turned to more tractable questions, or accepted the cultural verdict that the future belonged elsewhere. Einstein did not fully do any of those things. He could write on broader matters, comment on public issues, and remain intellectually aware of developments around him. But the gravitational center of his scientific life stayed with unified field theory. It had become the place where his philosophical commitments, his mathematical instincts, and his memory of what a great physical theory ought to look like all converged. To abandon it would have meant more than discarding one research problem. It would have meant loosening his hold on a certain image of reality itself. That is why the later search feels so moving in retrospect. It was not merely an instance of being wrong. It was a prolonged attempt to recover, through ever more demanding means, the kind of intelligibility that had animated Einstein's finest work from the beginning. He kept returning to the thought that somewhere beneath the statistical success of quantum mechanics and the untidy plurality of modern physics, there must still be a single lawful architecture. He kept trying to write it down. He kept discovering that the equations would not quite become the world he needed them to describe. And while he remained inside that long detour, the landscape around him did not stand still. Other physicists were moving into new territories, learning new formal languages, discovering new phenomena, and building a different future for fundamental theory. The longer Einstein continued his search, the more the surrounding discipline changed the terms of what counted as a promising path at all. To understand why his project gradually came to look less like the next great synthesis and more like a beautiful divergence, we have to widen the frame and watch physics itself begin to speak in a language increasingly unlike his own. And while Einstein remained faithful to that search for a single lawful architecture, the discipline around him was becoming something else. The shift did not happen all at once. It arrived through discoveries, through new mathematical habits, through laboratories that began producing facts no older picture had anticipated. and through a generation of physicists increasingly willing to trust methods that worked before they could be fully explained in the philosophical terms Einstein preferred. If you stand back and watch the field between the late 1920s and the years after the Second World War, what becomes visible is not merely progress. It is a change in style, in temperament, in what counted as a satisfying answer. Einstein was still asking for unity, continuity, and a reality beneath appearances. Physics, almost without announcing it, had begun learning to live with a world that looked more crowded, more provisional, and less willing to be gathered into one serene geometry. At first, this new world still seemed partly continuous with the old. Quantum mechanics had already established itself as a powerful framework for atoms, spectra, and the strange rules governing microscopic behavior. Yet even within that success, there remained an unresolved tension. The theory was extraordinarily effective, but when applied to electromagnetic radiation and the behavior of particles at higher energies, deep technical difficulties emerged. The mathematics produced infinities. Interactions that looked manageable in a simple atom became unstable and conceptually difficult when fields and particles were treated together with full seriousness. For Einstein, such difficulties might have looked like evidence that the existing quantum framework was still incomplete at a fundamental level. For many younger theorists, however, they looked like technical obstacles to be worked through, not signs that the entire direction of modern physics had gone astray. This difference in attitude mattered more than it first appears. Einstein tended to judge a theory by what sort of world it revealed. Many of the rising theorists judged it by what it could successfully calculate, regularize, and connect to experiment. That did not mean they were shallow or philosophically indifferent. Some of them thought very deeply, indeed. But the emotional center of the field was moving away from grand conceptual synthesis and toward a more flexible relation between formalism and truth. If the mathematics delivered extraordinarily accurate results, then one could tolerate a degree of interpretive unease. In that atmosphere, the question changed. The deepest issue was no longer always, what must reality be like? Increasingly, it became, how do we make the theory work? And how far can it take us? Meanwhile, nature kept supplying new complications. In 1932, James Chadwick discovered the neutron, a result that transformed the picture of atomic structure. The nucleus was no longer a simple compact core whose mysteries could be postponed. It became its own active terrain, dense with questions about binding, stability, and transformation. In the same year, Carl Anderson identified the positron, a positively charged counterpart to the electron, lending dramatic support to Paul Dirac's theory and suggesting that matter had a symmetrical richness far beyond the older inventory of particles. Suddenly, the microscopic world was not just quantum. It was proliferating. New entities were entering the stage, and with them came fresh demands on theory. That proliferation altered the entire emotional geometry of fundamental physics. The earlier hope that gravity and electromagnetism might form the obvious central pair of forces now faced a more disorderly landscape. Nuclear phenomena would not remain peripheral. They were pushing their way toward the center of the scientific imagination. As work on radioactivity, nuclear binding, and subatomic interactions advanced, it became harder to believe that a satisfactory foundational theory could limit itself to the grand marriage of gravitation and electromagnetism. Einstein's program was shaped by a world in which those two forces still looked like the most natural candidates for unification. The actual field was moving toward a world in which the nucleus, and later the growing zoo of subatomic particles, demanded an entirely broader language. This is one of the quiet reasons Einstein's work began to feel less central. Even apart from the philosophical disputes over quantum mechanics, he was searching for deep order in a landscape that kept becoming empirically messier. The discovery of the neutron was not merely one more fact. It widened the gap between his preferred framework and the actual frontier problems occupying physics. The new questions were not obviously geometric. They did not present themselves as elegant refinements of the relativistic field picture. They came from scattering experiments, from radioactive decays, from puzzling interactions inside the nucleus, from a realm where the old visual continuity of field theory no longer seemed enough. Then, in 1935, Hideki Yukawa proposed that the force-binding protons and neutrons in the nucleus might be mediated by a new particle. This was a remarkable step, because it treated interaction itself in a way very different from Einstein's program. Rather than seeking to derive all physical relations from one underlying geometry, the emerging particle approach allowed forces to be associated with exchanged quanta. With carriers introduced through a field-theoretic scheme that was neither classical nor geometrically unified in Einstein's sense. Here again, physics was changing its language. A force could be understood through particles. Particles could be understood through fields. The relation between these categories became more dynamic and less metaphysically settled. For Einstein, who hoped to dissolve the distinction between matter and field within a single continuous ontology, this was not the kind of progress he had been seeking. The experimental discoveries of the following years only deepened the divergence. The muon, first detected in cosmic rays in the 1930s, did not fit neatly into the theoretical expectations of the time. Later came the pion, then a growing succession of strange and unstable particles. These findings created both excitement and confusion. The microscopic world began to look crowded in a way that no one working from the clean ambitions of the early unification dream had quite anticipated. The old image of a sparse and elegant foundation gave way to something more like an overfilled cabinet of nature's hidden inventory. If you were hoping that the next great step in physics would reduce everything to a more unified simplicity, this was a disorienting development. The facts were multiplying faster than the coherence, and yet physics did not respond to this complexity by retreating. It adapted. It built new techniques. It learned how to treat theories as tools that might be locally successful, even when their deeper status remained uncertain. This shift became especially visible in quantum electrodynamics, or QED, the quantum field theory describing the interaction of light and charged particles in its early forms. QED was plagued by infinities that made calculations appear nonsensical. Self-energy terms diverged. Vacuum behavior generated alarming formal trouble. To someone shaped by Einstein's standards, these pathologies could look like signs that the entire approach rested on the wrong foundation. But by the late 1940s, theorists such as Richard Feynman, Julian Schwinger, Shinichiro Tomonaga, and Freeman Dyson developed renormalization methods that allowed the infinities to be controlled in practice, producing predictions of astonishing precision. This was a decisive moment, and not only for technical reasons. Renormalization represented a triumph of a very different scientific temperament from Einstein's. It did not begin by offering a final picture of reality purified of all ambiguity. It began by showing that one could take a formally troubled theory and extract from it results that matched experiment to an extraordinary degree. the anomalous magnetic moment of the electron, the Lamb shift, and other quantities could now be calculated with breathtaking accuracy. A theory that might once have seemed conceptually compromised became, in practice, one of the most successful constructions in the history of science. That kind of success changes a field. It teaches physicists what to value. It creates trust in methods that may once have looked provisional. It also makes objections like Einstein's feel, to many, increasingly distant from the living center of discovery. The contrast is worth lingering on. Einstein wanted a theory that began with clear principles and disclosed a coherent reality. Post-war quantum field theory often advanced by accepting that clarity might come later, if at all. One proceeded by careful formal manipulation, by comparison with experiment, by constructing calculational schemes that worked even when their philosophical meaning remained under debate. There is no need to caricature this difference. The architects of QED were not anti-intellectual mechanics. They were extraordinarily inventive thinkers, but they were operating inside a changed culture of physics, one in which effectiveness had become a more trusted guide than ontological transparency. The discipline had learned to tolerate local success without final metaphysical closure. At the same time, the institutional world of physics was changing too. During the first half of the 20th century, and especially after the war, science became more collective, more tied to large laboratories, more dependent on experimental apparatus of increasing scale and complexity. Particle accelerators, cloud chambers, nuclear instruments, and new methods of detection began shaping the rhythm of research. The image of the solitary theorist discovering the universe through principle alone did not disappear, but it no longer stood alone at the summit of the field's imagination. Einstein's style, formed in an earlier era where conceptual daring could redraw the foundations almost from a desk, now coexisted with a research culture driven by faster feedback between formal theory and highly specific experiment. The ground under his kind of ambition was shifting socially as well as intellectually. The war years intensified this transformation. Nuclear physics acquired a new urgency, then a terrifying political significance. The chain reactions studied in laboratories became weapons. The atom ceased to be merely a philosophical and scientific object. It entered statecraft, industry, military planning, and public fear. Although Einstein's own role in the direct construction of the bomb was limited, the world surrounding physics after 1945 was not the same world in which the unified field dream had first taken shape. Fundamental research was increasingly entangled with institutions, funding structures, engineering, secrecy, and national power. The center of gravity within the discipline moved toward domains Einstein neither chose nor controlled. In such a landscape, his long pursuit of a deeper geometrical theory could appear almost detached from the pulse of the age. There was another transformation, quieter but equally decisive. Earlier in the century, many theorists still hoped that the right theory would simplify the world by reducing variety to a few transparent principles. By the 1950s, the actual practice of high-energy physics often felt like the management of abundance. New particles appeared. New symmetries were proposed. New classification schemes emerged to cope with the multiplication of phenomena. It was not yet the standard model. It was a prelude full of disorder and ingenuity. But the direction was unmistakable. Fundamental physics was no longer narrowing elegantly toward a simple pair of forces awaiting union. It was learning to survive amid diversity, to use group theory, scattering methods, and increasingly abstract formal tools to organize a world more crowded than Einstein's program had expected. This is why the phrase physics changed its language as more than a metaphor. The grammar of explanation had shifted. In Einstein's most characteristic mode of thought, one began from principles of deep coherence and asked what sort of world they implied. In the newer mode, especially in quantum field theory and particle physics, one often began with formal schemes, symmetries, perturbative methods, and experimental regularities, then extracted predictions without insisting that every conceptual tension be resolved in advance. The field became less like a search for one definitive image and more like a disciplined negotiation with nature's complexity. Many physicists found this liberating. Einstein found it unsatisfying. Even the meaning of elegance was changing. For Einstein, elegance often meant conceptual necessity, the feeling that the right structure could not be otherwise. In the new physics, elegance could mean calculational power, symmetry properties, formal compactness, or the surprising effectiveness of a theory across many phenomena despite its interpretive opacity. These are not trivial differences. They shape what researchers pursue, what they admire, and what they forgive. A theory burdened by infinities but rescued by renormalization could still be embraced if it delivered exact answers. A geometrically beautiful unified program with weak empirical traction could increasingly be set aside, even if it appealed to the deepest philosophical instincts of an older master. None of this means Einstein was simply irrational to continue. From within his own standards, much of the new culture of physics must have looked like an accommodation with incompleteness. Quantum electrodynamics worked brilliantly. Yes, but did it reveal the true architecture of reality? The particle proliferation yielded empirical richness. Yes. But did it clarify the ontological basis of matter and force? Nuclear and particle physics transformed the subject. But did they bring physics closer to the kind of unified understanding that had once seemed the great promise of modern theory? Einstein could reasonably answer no to all of these questions. He was not refusing success. He was refusing to let success define the ultimate aim. Still, history has a way of rewarding the people who move with its momentum. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, younger physicists increasingly saw the future in techniques and problems remote from Einstein's central concerns. The subject he had once helped remake was now being remade again without him. His search for unity was continuing, but it was continuing inside a world whose criteria of importance, rigor, and promise had shifted. The mismatch was becoming harder to ignore. He was still asking the old foundational question with immense seriousness. The surrounding field was proving, day by day, that many of its most exciting achievements could proceed without answering it. That is part of what makes the later story so poignant. Einstein did not lose his intelligence. He lost his era, the kind of explanation he most trusted, the kind of deep order he expected nature to contain, was no longer the instinctive destination of the discipline he had once led. Physics was moving toward a future rich with prediction, experiment, and formal success, but increasingly comfortable with fragmentation, provisionality, and layers of effective description. Einstein remained loyal to a more severe hope. He wanted the universe to be unified all the way down, and he wanted theory to make that unity visible. By now, then, the gap was no longer only technical or philosophical. It had become historical. Einstein's program and mainstream physics were beginning to inhabit different times at once. The field around him accelerated into new methods, new institutions, and new particles, while he continued trying to uncover the single structure that might restore coherence beneath the noise. That divergence would not merely shape the fate of his ideas. It would shape the emotional climate of his final decades, when fame, exile, moral authority, and a growing scientific solitude all gathered around the same aging figure in Princeton. And so, the divergence that had begun as a matter of theory slowly gathered a human setting around it. By the time Einstein's intellectual path was drifting away from the main current of physics, Europe itself was becoming darker, narrower, and more dangerous. The gap between him and the field was no longer only a gap of method or philosophy. It was now unfolding inside exile, inside public fame, inside old age, and inside a century whose violence pressed itself into the lives of scientists, whether they welcomed it or not. The search for a unified field did not continue in a protected chamber of pure thought. It continued while the world that had formed Einstein was coming apart. In the early 1930s, the political atmosphere in Germany changed with terrifying speed. Einstein had already become a target for nationalist resentment and anti-Semitic hostility long before Hitler took power. His internationalism, his Jewish identity, his pacifist reputation, and his symbolic role in modern science all made him useful to people who wanted a figure onto whom they could project cultural and political hatred. Relativity itself was attacked in some circles as alien, corrosive, or un-German. This was not merely disagreement about science. It was a sign that the intellectual world Einstein had inhabited, however imperfectly, was no longer stable enough to shelter him. When the Nazis rose to power in 1933, the danger ceased to be atmospheric and became immediate. Einstein did not remain in Germany to test whether reason might outlast the moment. He was abroad when Hitler became chancellor, and he chose not to return. That decision has often been told in large historical terms, and rightly so. But there was also something intimate about it, a country that had been central to his scientific life, a language in which he had done his greatest work, an academic world in which his name had once represented triumph. All of it was suddenly closing behind him. He resigned from the Prussian Academy and publicly severed ties. Property was raided. His name appeared on lists of enemies. It is possible to narrate this as a clean act of moral clarity, and certainly there was clarity in it. But exile is never clean. Even when necessary, it leaves a residue. It changes the texture of belonging. It makes every later room feel at least slightly provisional. Princeton became the setting in which that new life settled. The Institute for Advanced Study, newly founded and ambitious, offered Einstein a place unlike the older European universities that had shaped him. It promised time, freedom, prestige, and a community of extraordinary minds. But it was also part of a different world, quieter in some ways, more sheltered, more American, less entangled with the older intellectual geography of Central Europe. By 1935, he was living at 112 Mercer Street, in a modest house that would become inseparable from the final public image of him, the aging sage with disordered hair, walking slowly, receiving visitors, answering letters, continuing to work among papers that seemed always to hint at a deeper order no one else could quite see. The surroundings were calm. The calm was not the same as home. There is a tendency to imagine Princeton as a place of serene withdrawal, as though Einstein simply escaped there into contemplative peace. But his life in those years was full of interruption. He corresponded constantly. He received students, journalists, admirers, political petitioners, colleagues, refugees, public figures, and strangers seeking endorsement or wisdom. His name had acquired a scale that few scientists before him had ever carried. He was no longer merely a physicist, however great. He had become a moral emblem, a symbol of intelligence itself, a public conscience to whom people brought not only questions about the universe, but questions about war, nationalism, Zionism, civil liberties, race, and the future of civilization. That sort of fame does not simply flatter a life. It crowds it. At the same time, Einstein did not withdraw from public responsibility. He signed affidavits for refugees. He advocated on behalf of displaced scholars. He spoke against fascism and later against nuclear danger. He lent his name and energy to causes that he believed touched the survival of humane civilization. There is something moving in that willingness, because by then he had every excuse to retreat into private work. Instead, his later years became divided between two different kinds of demand. One came from the outer world, which treated him as a voice of moral seriousness. The other came from the inner world of theoretical physics, where the unfinished problem of unification continued to call him back. In one sphere, he was globally authoritative. In the other, his authority was becoming far less secure. That contrast is central to the emotional truth of these years. Outside physics, Einstein's stature only seemed to grow. He was photographed endlessly, quoted constantly, celebrated as the model of human genius. To ordinary people, and even to many educated observers, he was still the man who had changed the universe. The public did not follow the technical fate of unified field theory. It did not measure his daily relevance against the newest developments in nuclear forces, quantum electrodynamics, or particle experiments. As a cultural figure, he stood almost beyond rivalry. But inside the working life of modern physics, prestige was shifting elsewhere. Younger researchers were building the future in styles increasingly unlike his own. The man most of the world regarded as the living center of the discipline was, in a crucial professional sense, no longer standing at its center at all. That kind of separation can produce a peculiar solitude. It is not the solitude of obscurity. It is the solitude of being known too well in the wrong way. Einstein was surrounded by admiration, yet much of what he was admired for belonged to an earlier chapter of his life. His symbolic role kept expanding while his active scientific program became less persuasive to the community moving ahead around him. The public saw continuity. The discipline felt rupture. He himself would have felt both. This is one reason the later Princeton image is so haunting. It shows not only age, but temporal dislocation. Einstein was living in several historical positions at once, revered as a monument, active as a thinker, and increasingly isolated as a participant in frontier theory. The Institute for Advanced Study deepened that paradox rather than erasing it. On the one hand, it gave him exactly what many intellectuals dream of: freedom from teaching burdens, proximity to major scholars, the dignity of uninterrupted thought. On the other hand, that freedom could also intensify separation when the main project one pursues is drifting away from the dominant interests of the field. Einstein had colleagues, correspondents, and collaborators. But the broad momentum of post-war theoretical physics was not bending toward his office. It was bending toward quantum field theory, particle interactions, nuclear structure, new experimental results, and later toward the dense formal work that would define mid-century physics. Princeton offered him continuity of labor. It could not restore the sense that the larger discipline was traveling with him. His working habits during these years retained something simple and almost austere. He walked. He thought. He returned to equations. He met with assistants and collaborators. He filled pages with attempts to force the world into a more unified language. The public mythology often turns this into a sentimental tableau, the elderly genius scribbling eternally at the board. Yet the reality was more demanding than the image. Unified field theory remained technically difficult, and Einstein continued to move through different formulations, evaluate objections, and test mathematical structures that might hold the key. He was not merely pretending to work in order to preserve dignity. He was still genuinely working. That matters because it prevents the later life from collapsing into pure pathos. The loneliness was real, but so was the labor. Age, however, changes the meaning of labor. In youth or middle life, an unfinished program can feel open, expandable, full of possible decades. In later years, the same program begins to absorb time differently. Each reformulation carries a faint awareness that there may not be many more. Einstein rarely wrote in a melodramatic register about this, and one should be careful not to project too much private despair onto him. Still, chronology has its own pressure. By the 1940s and early 1950s, he was continuing a search that had already lasted for decades. The field around him had changed. His wife Elsa had died in 1936. Many of the great figures of his earlier European world were scattered, aged, dead, or occupied with different frontiers. The continuity that remained was internal. It resided in his own commitment to the problem. Exile sharpened that inwardness. People often speak of exile as movement across geography. But for a thinker, it also alters the continuity of memory. Einstein's life in America never fully erased the older landscapes of Zurich, Bern, Berlin, Leiden, Brussels, or the intellectual circles in which his scientific personality had first taken shape. The Princeton years were therefore lived partly in the presence of absence. He was physically safe, institutionally honored, materially secure enough, yet separated from the European world that had given his mind its earliest public stage. The language around him was different. The rhythms of academic life were different. Even where he was welcomed, he remained, in some measure, someone who had arrived from elsewhere. That feeling does not necessarily make one miserable. It does, however, deepen the temptation to seek stability in thought when history has made the outer world unreliable. Perhaps this is one reason unified field theory took on such emotional density. It was never simply a technical undertaking. It became a place where Einstein could continue to live inside the deepest continuity of his own intellectual life. The world outside had fractured itself through dictatorship, displacement, and technological violence. The world of physics had fragmented into methods and discoveries he did not believe yielded final understanding. Against both kinds of fragmentation, the unified field remained a promise of order. One should not reduce this to psychology, as though his science were merely an emotional compensation. That would be too crude. But it would also be too crude to pretend that a thinker's deepest commitments float untouched above the texture of their life. In Einstein's case, philosophical fidelity and personal history were winding ever more tightly around the same central pursuit. The burden of public history made the contrast sharper still. Einstein's famous 1939 letter to Franklin Roosevelt, warning of the potential military implications of nuclear fission, linked his name forever to the nuclear age. even though he did not participate directly in building the bomb. Later, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he became one of the public figures most strongly associated with the moral crisis of atomic warfare. Again, the outer world turned toward him as witness, conscience, and symbol. Yet while he spoke about war and peace in public, his scientific days continued to circle around a private theoretical ambition that the post-war generation increasingly regarded as marginal. The man who, for millions, personified science as power and responsibility was spending his professional life on a program that the most influential parts of science no longer considered central. The irony is difficult to miss. There was also a subtler loneliness created by style. Einstein's mode of thought had always relied on a certain balance of physical intuition and mathematical principle. He could be abstract, of course, but he wanted abstraction to reveal a coherent reality. Much of mid-century theoretical physics, by contrast, became more technically specialized, more collaborative, more enmeshed with formal methods whose immediate physical meaning could be deferred. The gap between Einstein and younger theorists was not only about which theory was right, it was about what kind of thinking felt alive. A new professional language was spreading through the field. Einstein could understand it. He did not wish to inhabit it. This kind of isolation is easy to romanticize, and many have done exactly that. It is tempting to imagine Einstein in Princeton as the noble outsider, the lone guardian of depth against a culture of narrower experts. There is some emotional appeal in that image, but it oversimplifies the situation. The younger physicists were not mere technicians, and Einstein's distance from them was not pure moral superiority. They were solving real problems, producing real results, and building frameworks of extraordinary power. At the same time, the standard story that treats Einstein as simply out of touch is too thin in the opposite direction. He was isolated, yes, but not because he had ceased to think seriously. He was isolated because he continued to think seriously in a language the field was learning to outgrow. That difference can be felt in the way colleagues spoke about him. There remained immense respect, even affection. But respect is not the same as intellectual companionship. Many younger physicists admired Einstein as a foundational figure while quietly setting aside the program that now occupied him. They visited the monument, one might say, but they did not build their future there. Scientific loneliness often takes this form. You are still honored, still invited, still listened to, yet the real conversation has moved somewhere else. No single act of exclusion is required. Time itself performs the separation. And still he worked. That simple fact gives the later years their dignity. Einstein did not retire inward into mere nostalgia. He did not spend his days only reliving 1905 or 1915. He continued pursuing the deeper structure he believed should exist, even as evidence mounted that the field no longer shared his priorities. He kept returning to the demand for coherence with a kind of stern patience. It may be that the very persistence which made his program historically unfruitful is also what makes his later life so difficult to dismiss. He refused the easier role history had prepared for him, the role of revered elder explaining his past triumphs to the world. He insisted on remaining unfinished. In that insistence, one can feel both strength and cost. Strength, because he would not exchange intellectual seriousness for ceremonial greatness. Cost, because the pursuit drew him farther into a domain where fewer and fewer contemporaries believed discovery was likely. The same loyalty that preserved his integrity also deepened his separateness. Princeton, with its quiet streets and careful lawns, became the setting for that paradox. Here was the most famous scientist in the world, living simply, answering letters, walking home, speaking on behalf of civilization, and spending his scientific life on equations that almost no one expected to transform the future. There are many forms of loneliness. One of them is to be surrounded by reverence while remaining unconvinced by the world that reveres you. By the time Einstein approached the last years of his life, the emotional shape of the story had become unmistakable. Exile had severed the old world. Fame had made him universally visible. Moral responsibility had enlarged his public voice. Age had narrowed the horizon of time. And through all of it, the unified field remained the unfinished center, the place where his idea of nature, his memory of scientific truth, and his resistance to the prevailing order all continued to meet. To call that merely stubborn would miss the depth of the attachment. To call it heroic without qualification would miss the tragedy. It was something more difficult than either of those words. And from that difficulty, a final question begins to rise. If Einstein spent these years pursuing a path that did not lead where he hoped, what exactly was wrong about it? Was he wrong in the fullest sense, chasing a mirage that physics had already outgrown? Or was he holding on to a question that remained profound, even if his route to the answer could not succeed? To understand the true shape of his failure and the strange afterlife of the hopes he would not release, we have to look one last time at the title itself and ask whether the idea he spent his life chasing was wrong, or whether it was wrong in a more complicated way than history first makes it appear. That question lingers because the title itself is slightly dangerous. It promises a judgment, and history always tempts us toward clean judgments. A genius spends his life chasing the wrong idea. The phrase has a certain sharpness to it, a satisfying shape. But once you have walked through Einstein's later life with any patience, the edges begin to blur. Wrong in what sense? Wrong about the existence of a deeper unity in nature. Wrong about quantum mechanics. Wrong about the standards by which a theory should be judged. Or wrong in a narrower, more tragic way. Wrong about the root. While remaining attached to questions that physics never stopped asking in one form or another. If we answer too quickly, we lose the part of the story that makes it enduring. Einstein's unified field program, taken as a concrete research path, did not succeed. It did not produce the master theory he hoped for. It did not become the foundation on which modern particle physics was built. It did not displace quantum mechanics, nor did it explain the growing world of subatomic phenomena that came to dominate 20th century theory. On those points, the record is plain enough. The equations he pursued through so many reformulations never became the language in which the rest of physics learned to speak. In that historical sense, yes. He spent decades on a path that did not lead where he believed it would. And yet, the broader longing that drove him did not disappear with him. Physics did not, after Einstein, settle happily into permanent fragmentation. It did not decide that unification had been a beautiful but childish dream, best abandoned. In fact, some of the greatest achievements after his death moved toward unification in ways that would have been immediately legible to him as belonging to the same family of hope, even if the methods were not his own. One of the deepest ironies in this story is that the ideal of unity survived and, in certain domains, flourished. What failed was not the desire to bring nature under one deeper order. What failed was Einstein's insistence that the correct path to that order would remain classical, continuous, and primarily geometrical in the sense he preferred. This becomes clearer when one looks at what later 20th century physics actually accomplished. The Standard Model, though often taught as a collection of highly technical structures, is at heart a vast act of unification. Electromagnetism and the weak nuclear interaction, once treated as distinct, were shown in the 1960s and 1970s to be different aspects of a single electroweak framework. Gauge symmetries, quantum fields, and spontaneous symmetry breaking provided the language for that synthesis. The strong interaction found its place in quantum chromodynamics. The result was not a final theory of everything, and certainly not a reconciliation of gravity with quantum mechanics, but it was a powerful vindication of the idea that nature's apparent variety can conceal deeper unity. Einstein would have recognized the ambition at once, even if he would have resisted the tools by which it was realized. That is why it is too simple to say he was wrong to want a grand synthesis. He was not wrong to think that the universe might be governed by fewer and deeper principles than appearances suggest. Modern physics repeatedly rewards that instinct. Symmetry principles, gauge structure, conserved quantities, and unified frameworks have all shown that the world is more internally connected than surface phenomena would lead one to expect. The desire to reduce multiplicity to order remains one of the great engines of the field. If that desire were itself misguided, much of modern theory would look very different. Einstein's failure, then, cannot be located in the dream of unity alone. It has to be located in the specific form he believed unity must take. And here the contrast with later physics becomes especially revealing. The unifications that succeeded after Einstein did not arise by restoring a classical picture of reality beneath quantum mechanics. They arose by taking quantum field theory more seriously, not less. They embraced precisely the kinds of formal and probabilistic structures Einstein distrusted. They did not return to a serene ontology of continuous fields from which particles and forces could be derived in one geometrical breath. Instead, they worked through gauge groups, quantum excitations, renormalization, symmetry breaking, and effective descriptions whose meaning was often subtler than the old dream of direct intelligibility. Unity was achieved, but not in the tone he wanted. It came through a language he regarded as insufficiently fundamental. So perhaps one way to put it is this: Einstein was right about the destination in a very broad philosophical sense, and wrong about the road. He wanted a deeper coherence. Physics kept moving toward coherence. He wanted the world to reveal hidden order behind apparent diversity. Physics kept discovering hidden order, but he also wanted that order to preserve a certain style of reality: local, objective, continuous, and in principle picturable as a determinate structure independent of observation. On that point, the century moved away from him. The unity that emerged did not rescue classical realism in the form he had defended. It passed through quantum theory rather than beyond it. The story becomes even stranger when we return to his objections to quantum mechanics. For many years, Einstein was treated as the great loser in that argument, the majestic but ultimately defeated critic of a theory that went on to prove itself more and more brilliantly. That verdict contains much truth. The practical success of quantum mechanics, and later of quantum field theory, is overwhelming. Countless experiments support its predictions. Technologies from semiconductors to lasers to modern chemistry rest on principles that Einstein could not have dismissed and did not dismiss. He was plainly wrong to think that quantum mechanics would simply collapse under the weight of its own incompleteness anytime soon. It did not. It became one of the most successful frameworks in the history of human thought. But he was not wrong about the depth of the conceptual disturbance. This is where the afterlife of the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen argument becomes so important. In 1964, nearly a decade after Einstein's death, John Bell proved something astonishing. If one assumes that physical properties have definite values independent of measurement, and that influences do not propagate instantaneously across distance in a certain classical sense, then no theory of local hidden variables can reproduce all the statistical predictions of quantum mechanics. Bell transformed what had often seemed like a cloudy philosophical dispute into something testable. He showed that Einstein's discomfort had not been based on mere nostalgia. The EPR paper had touched a real nerve in the foundations of physics. Later experiments, beginning with increasingly persuasive tests in the 1970s and 1980s, and continuing in ever more sophisticated forms, strongly supported the quantum predictions. In that narrow and crucial sense, Einstein lost again. The world does not appear to permit the sort of local, hidden variable completion he would have preferred. Something has to give, either locality, separability, or classical realism in the old sense cannot survive untouched. Yet Bell also gave Einstein a strange posthumous vindication. He showed that Einstein had been right to insist that the questions raised by EPR were not verbal quibbles. Quantum mechanics did carry radical implications about the structure of physical reality. Bohr had not merely won a dispute over interpretation. The theory itself was committed to a world more unsettling than many of its early defenders had perhaps wished to say clearly. That matters because it changes the emotional balance of the story. Einstein was wrong to think that a local realist completion of quantum mechanics was likely to restore the kind of world he wanted. But he was right that the standard interpretation asked physics to swallow something profound and difficult. He was right that the argument over completeness cut to the heart of what reality is. He was right that operational success alone did not dissolve the philosophical strangeness. Even the modern field of quantum information, which embraces quantum entanglement as a resource rather than treating it only as a conceptual problem, still lives inside a terrain that Einstein helped expose with unusual clarity. He did not solve the problem, but he helped define its true depth. The same layered judgment applies to his attitude toward completeness. Einstein's instinct was that a finished theory should tell us what exists, not merely what outcomes to expect. Modern physics has often proceeded more pragmatically than that. Effective field theories, renormalization group ideas, and layered descriptions of nature have taught physicists to tolerate the possibility that understanding comes in levels rather than in one final metaphysical unveiling. In that sense, Einstein's standards may have been too absolute for the actual structure of scientific progress. Nature may not offer a single final view in the form he wanted, at least not one available to us yet. And yet, even here, his refusal still exerts force. The desire for deeper explanation never went away. It simply learned to wear more flexible clothing. Nowhere is that clearer than in the continuing search for quantum gravity. General relativity and quantum mechanics remain, to this day, two astonishingly successful frameworks that do not fit together easily at the deepest level. The dream of a more unified theory has not ended. It survives in string theory, loop quantum gravity, causal approaches, emergent space-time ideas, and other attempts to reconcile gravitation with the quantum world. These programs differ profoundly from Einstein's late unified fieldwork. but they are driven by something he would have recognized immediately. The conviction remains that nature cannot finally rest in two incompatible pillars. Somewhere, beneath the divide, there must be a deeper order. The question he spent his last decades chasing has not been dismissed. It has simply been reformulated by later generations. And yet the difference between reformulating a question and vindicating a person matters. Einstein's own late work did not provide the bridge. His specific program failed to incorporate the actual structure of the microscopic world as it came to be understood. It did not anticipate the successful architecture of gauge theories. It did not offer the experimentally fruitful framework that later unification efforts would require. Even the continuing search for quantum gravity does not rescue his path in any direct sense. One can honor the depth of his question without pretending that his equations secretly contained the future. They did not. History is full of profound intuitions attached to inadequate formulations. Einstein's late life belongs partly to that category. This is why his story is more valuable than a simple triumph or failure tale would allow. He shows us that scientific error at the highest level is often inseparable from scientific greatness. The same inner habits that had once led him toward revolutionary truth. Distrust of superficial appearances, faith in hidden order, refusal to stop at instrumental success, later kept him bound to a program that could not meet the actual demands of the evolving field. There is no sharp line where genius ends and mistake begins. Very often, they are expressions of the same structure of mind. Einstein did not become someone else in old age. He remained, with painful consistency, himself. That continuity is important because it rescues the story from a crude morale. He did not fail because he stopped being brilliant. He failed partly because brilliance can become loyal to its own deepest standards, even when the world no longer answers to them in the same way. His standards had once unlocked nature magnificently. Later, they became a filter through which too much of the new physics seemed unsatisfactory to accept. In that sense, the tragedy is not that Einstein betrayed his best self. The tragedy is that he remained faithful to it under conditions where that faith no longer led toward the most fruitful path. There's also a broader lesson here about science itself. Scientific progress is often described as the accumulation of correct answers. But that image is far too neat. Fields move forward through grand wrong turns as well as through verified success. They move because someone asks a question large enough to reorganize the imagination of a discipline. Even if the first or second or third answer to that question fails, they move because an unsolved tension continues to wound the mind. Einstein's late work mattered less by what it achieved directly than by what it refused to relinquish. He kept alive the demand that physics should aim at more than predictive control. He insisted that beneath practical success, there remains the harder question of what the world is. Even when that insistence did not produce the theory he wanted, it preserved an ambition without which physics would be intellectually poorer. And perhaps that is why the title continues to feel unstable in the most interesting way. The wrong idea suggests a closed case, as though history has already stamped the file and slid it into an archive. But the closer you come, the less final the phrase becomes. Einstein was wrong about important things. He misjudged the direction in which successful fundamental theory would develop. He underestimated how deeply quantum mechanics and quantum field theory would shape the future. He held too tightly to a local realist image of nature that later work would seriously strain. All of that belongs in the account. Yet he was also right that the deepest work of physics would continue to circle around unity, completeness, and the unsettling question of whether the formal success of a theory amounts to genuine understanding. If you imagine him late in life, still returning to the page, still trying to make the equations close, there is a temptation either to pity him or to sentimentalize him. Both responses miss something. Pity makes him smaller than he was. Sentimentality makes him easier than he was. A better response is something like respect mixed with unease. Respect. Because he continued asking for a level of intelligibility that many would have abandoned. Unease. Because history did not reward that demand in the form he expected. He stands. In the end, as a reminder that the path from insight to error is not a fall from greatness into mediocrity. Sometimes it is greatness continuing past the point where the world is willing to follow. So was he wrong? Yes. If by that we mean that the road he devoted so much of his final life to did not lead to the theory modern physics actually built. Yes. If by that we mean that his objections to quantum mechanics did not overturn the framework that came to dominate the century. Yes. If by that we mean that the kind of local, deterministic completion he hoped for has not emerged as the winning answer. But no, if by wrong we mean foolish, irrelevant, or blind to the deepest pressures inside physics. No. If by wrong we mean that the desire for deeper unity was itself a dead impulse. And no, if by wrong we mean that failure has no lasting place in the architecture of truth, the final image, then, is not of a genius wasted by a mistake. It is of a mind reaching beyond the point at which success was still likely, because the question remained too large to abandon. Einstein's later search did not give physics its final theory. It gave something more ambiguous and, in its own way, more human. It revealed how far a scientist may go in loyalty to a vision of reality, how costly that loyalty can become, and how the boundary between error and insight is often drawn only after history has already moved on. Long after the papers have yellowed and the specific equations have ceased to guide the field. That boundary remains unsettled enough to keep us listening. In the end, Einstein never found the final theory he was looking for, the unified field he pursued through so many pages, so many revisions, and so many quiet years in Princeton never became the master key to nature he believed it might be. Yet the deeper question that drove him never disappeared. Can the universe be understood as one coherent whole? Is the apparent disorder of the quantum world the last word? Or only a sign that something more fundamental still waits beyond it? In that sense, the path Einstein followed may have failed, but the longing behind it never truly left physics. What changed, perhaps more than anything, was our sense of what science is allowed to be. Nature did not arrange itself around human preference for simplicity, certainty, or elegance. It proved stranger than Einstein wished, and more mathematically elusive than many had imagined. And still, his resistance mattered. By refusing to settle too easily, by pressing on questions others were willing to set aside, he helped define the intellectual tension at the heart of modern physics. Even being wrong, he clarified what was at stake. He reminded science that success is not the same as understanding, and that a theory can work astonishingly well while still leaving behind a feeling that something essential has not yet been said. Perhaps that is why this story lingers. Scientific curiosity is not only the search for correct answers, it is also the search for forms of meaning that the world does not always grant us. Sometimes a great discovery arrives because someone follows the evidence where it leads. Sometimes a great failure matters because someone keeps asking whether the evidence is all there is. And so the image that remains is not simply of an old man pursuing a lost cause, but of a mind still listening for a deeper harmony in the universe. Whether that harmony exists in the form Einstein imagined or not, the search for it continues, carried forward by each generation that looks at nature and senses that its final language has not yet been fully heard.